The stories that we tell about the future habitability of Earth are continuously informing humanity's chances of survival. And we're not talking about the stories that are told to the larger public, although they are indeed important, but the stories state institutions, banks, and NGOs tell themselves and each other. These fictions guide policies, laws, CO2 emissions, influence the breathability of the air, and the quality of our food. The stories are crafted here in the boardroom. The performance of public commitments, binding signatures, and handshakes leads to delusions about actions which always happen elsewhere in the future. In the climate science field, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has crafted 5 narratives to predict how socioeconomic parameters will guide the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They're called shared socioeconomic pathways and map 5 different roads, forking into different scenarios, with divergent consequences unfolding through the upcoming 80 years. There is a green road, the rocky road, the highway, and so on. The IPCC pathways refer to historically and culturally specific indicators that do not necessarily prioritize the thriving of ours and other species. For instance, level of equality, education, and health are measured by their link to the GDP, a mere representation of wealth that is inadequate in addressing the existential threat climate collapse faces us with. SSP scenario modeling relies on the access and availability of socioeconomic data, which is unevenly distributed across nation-states and regions. The practice of futurology in climate change discourse often takes the shape of institutionalized wishful thinking. The role of scenario planning is to entertain fantasies of success, constantly deferring into the future, to help explain away present failures. Visualizing the future as a branching tree full of possibilities locates climate change into an outside realm, preventing us from dealing with it. The roads and branches are pictured as metaphorical paths that, it is suggested, we can choose to follow. The reality is more complex than that. We have already crossed some of the thresholds that will trigger non-linear and abrupt environmental change, also known as planetary boundaries. What is more interesting than apocalyptic prophecies is perhaps looking at the models that are already terraforming Earth today and think of how those can be made operational. The linkages between present, past, and future manifest themselves in what we call governing simulations. They are the models and projections which emerge when separate processes within the material reality are translated into approximate representations of themselves. These models reorganize the material reality in their image, enacting the recursive process in which the simulation governs what it is modeling. We want to look at those models that are already terraforming Earth and take them as the starting point to conceive the future as a recursive and eternal present. We therefore focus on filling the gap between the jure institutional discourse on climate change and de facto recursivity of governing simulations. On the 20th of April of 2020, the price of oil went negative for the first time in history. The oil market runs on futures contracts, which are the forward price of oil, or the expectation that oil will be at a certain price on a given date in the future. In April 2020, the expectation of the value of the commodity going forward was set to be below zero. The practical implication of the negative price meant that oil producers would offer to pay warehouse buyers money to get rid of the excess supply of barrels. At the center of it was Cushing, Oklahoma, the designated storage site for futures, where the barrels of oil tied to the futures contracts are physically delivered. The site is comprised of cylinder reservoirs with floating roofs, arranged in orderly grids. The circular topology for storing of oil was invented by a Russian engineer, Vladimir Zhukov, in Azerbaijan in 1878, 30 years after the world's first commercial oil well was drilled there. In the early 21st century, hedge funds and other speculators would use drone and satellite imagery to estimate how full or empty the oil cylinders were at a certain point in time. They would use the images taken from above to capture the shadows on top of their floating roofs, which would then inform the future speculation. And so, when the storage was full, the prices would drop. This particular incident reveals how the recursive nature of the process is, in fact, premised on the different qualities of light. How the drone and satellite sensors that gather data through an exchange of electromagnetic frequencies are here used to register the optical phenomena of light and shadow on top of their oil tanks. They infer the capacity of cylinders which store the products of decay from the organisms that, themselves, came to life because of photosynthesis millions of years ago. The synchronicity of these processes is, however, in contrast with the disparity of scale between the deep time processes of fossilization that made possible the extraction of oil and the speed of light trading exchanges all over the world. In April, this disparity manifested itself clearly. Crude oil went from resource to waste in a matter of hours, and the caching storage facility became a dumping ground. A study from 2013 describes how the scanning of the surface of the Black Sea with remote sensing technologies revealed a disproportionate amount of oil spills of shipping origins within the Russian sector of the sea and on its borders. Oil tankers, when traveling empty, carried tanks filled with ballast seawater to achieve the best velocity and stability configurations. The water that becomes mixed with oil particles is then dumped back into the sea, either in authorized discharge zones or legal dumping grounds, to prepare the space later filled with valuable cargo. Sensed through synthetic aperture radar, these oil spills perform as contrast dye used in X-ray exams. They visually highlight where the Russian territory ends in the allegedly borderless territory of the sea, like the coloring book outlines on its surface, all due to questions of jurisdiction, governance, accountability, and value. What happens in 10 or 100 or 500 years when the Arctic keeps melting and the sea level rises, and those oil borders in the Black Sea spill into other countries? Will Russia accept the accountability and jurisdiction over the task of cleaning up those dams because that will lead to an expansion of its territory? Or is it that by then, there won't be any nation states at all to care about the territorial disputes? Access to technologies of extended vision and remote sensing inform the way in which fragments of reality are read and simulated. It posits the possibility of control over a territory in the case it is identified as a carrier of a valuable resource. This recursive relationship between sensing and sovereignty is, however, not limited by territorial disputes. It can determine claims of jurisdictions over a commodity, an ecological phenomenon, or even a metabolic process. The resolution of the infrastructure for sensing and simulation appears within the process of climate modeling itself. The standard average resolution of the global climate models used by the IPCC for its fifth report consists of a 100 times 100 square kilometer cells within the grid that the biosphere is divided into, along the longitude and latitude of the globe. The horizontal model grids also extend vertically up through the atmosphere, where it is broken up into layers that can be as thin as 11 kilometers and down through the ocean. The simulation is then calculated in 30-minute steps to inform past or future climate projections. In the IPCC context, the spatial cell is a representation of balance, What is the biggest quantity of data you can feed into the model before it overwhelms the computational capacity that would be needed to calculate all possible interactions within the dataset? The question then is whether the same precision can be extended into the space between simulation and governance. That is, how do you render the simulation operational so that it can turn into recursive governance? Instead of thinking of high resolution as an abundance of data, we therefore focus on the question of fine-tuning and justification. We think of resolution as a level of precision with which the capture of data is fine-tuned to produce the simulation that are able to govern what is being captured, in a way that will bring the desirable ends in predictable ways. Cassandra saw a business opportunity in the growing field of nowcasting, data analytics, and increasingly complex sensing technologies. From Nader's usage of hot air balloons to create aerial photos of Paris, to Arthur Batut's experiments with kites, to the modifications made to Sputnik 1, enabling it to track cloud patterns, Cassandra carried the legacy of remote sensing onward with acute awareness of the scope of its applications. Their first breakthrough happened with the Carbon High-Res project. Having invested billions of dollars, Cassandra created the physical infrastructure, connecting technologies of carbon sensing with the private and public companies who were smart enough to see a market opportunity in carbon storage. The Carbon High-Res project was launched in the spring of 2030 and became a milestone in the ongoing efforts to terraform Earth. The surface of the planet was mapped and captured at high resolution. From space, now anyone could tell a red pine from a scarlet oak. The two species most efficient in sequestering CO2 attained the highest value and were hunted for by competing companies and governments. Now in full operation, the Carbon High-Res is comprised of a fleet of satellites which can count the leaves on a fern, perceiving its stems and margins, veins and venules, and estimate the CO2 that each little element can store with a high degree of accuracy. They run calculations in situ and report back to the decentralized control rooms on Earth, which regulate the price of CO2 in turn. Transitioning away from carbon tax and towards embracing recursive models that rely on high-resolution imagery, Cassandra was behind all of it. I was at the beach. The water was motionless. There was no wind. There was probably no air, no oxygen. I did not need to breathe. I could feel a big wave approaching. I could picture a wall of water in front of me. I felt powerless. I was just one step ahead of the rest of the people on the beach to notice it, but not so ahead as to be able to save any lives by warning them. I was in the state of anticipation that is not timely enough to make a difference for the world. Yet, I could feel the unease, the anxiety, not being able to point my finger at what that actually was. Time has entered a circular motion, and I'm caught in it. Before, I would stand at one point, my feet resting on a linear timeline, in the dark, in a dark, not quite black, but certainly light-absorbing landscape. The past before me, the future after me. But that is not how I actually was, even though it might have felt like that. That was then. This is now.